Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast, produced by the Technology Addiction team at the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre. I'm Dr. Sally Gainsbury, Professor in Psychology and leader of the Technology Addiction team and Director of the Gambling Research and Policy Unit. This season is titled Informed Decisions, Financial Behaviour in Persuasive Digital Environments. What we're looking at across these conversations is a central question of what does it actually take for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments they're navigating are specifically designed to influence their behaviour. This season is supported by BetWell, a free independent analytics tool developed by our team in the Brain and Mind Centre. This helps Australians who bet online regularly see their betting more clearly. You can find out more at betwell.org.au. The Technology, Risk and Gambling series is now a podcast. It's available on Apple's Podcasts, Spotify and wherever you listen. You can also find the videos on the Brain and Mind Centre YouTube channel along with the back series of the previous 5 seasons, so do check it out. And if you'd like to do me a favour, I would love it if you left a comment, a 5-star review, if you shared this episode or any that you love with a colleague, because those listening metrics let us know that people are listening and enjoying the content and we can keep producing more episodes. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Chandni Gupta, Deputy CEO of the Consumer Policy and Research Centre and a 2023 Churchill Fellow. Her research has built Australians' evidence base on deceptive design, practices embedded into digital technology that influence us in terms of how we make decisions and look at what serves a business versus a consumer. Welcome. Today I am joined by Chandni Gupta, who is the Deputy CEO and Digital Policy Director at the Consumer Policy Research Centre, Australia's leading independent consumer policy think tank, and as well as a 2023 Churchill Fellow, as you'll see many amazing Churchill Fellows featured on this podcast. So Chandni began her career building digital products and has spent the last several years documenting how those same products are designed to work against the people who use them. Her research in deceptive design, which are the design features embedded into websites and apps, which influence choices, we're going to get into the definitions, how they serve businesses rather than consumers, and have Chandni has generated the most comprehensive Australian evidence base on this issue, and I want to talk to her about how the Churchill Fellowship took her into multiple different countries to study this issue. Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar podcast. It is amazing to have you here and sharing such critical expertise. What you have to say is exactly what this whole season is about.
Thank you so much for having me, Sally. I'm just really looking forward to diving in with you.
Well, we're going to have to take a step back and bear with me and bear with all of us. My background is in gambling research, as you know, and I'm very interested in this idea of where is consumer choice, where is free will, where are the lines that people may sort of throw these terms around interchangeably. But what is the difference between what's persuasive versus coercive? What's marketing versus deceptive design? Can you take me through some of whether it's a legal definition, where are the frameworks, and are these specific lines or what I suspect it might be a little bit blurry?
These lines are really blurred, and over the last few years, what we've found is tactics such as deceptive design that's been built in, while might be framed as marketing, it's actually not. It's designed to be deliberately difficult, for example, to leave something that you want to, or it's designed in a particular way that you say yes to one option, which is the one the business prefers you to say yes to over another. And so that line's really blurred, but the way I really like to see it is it a decision that the consumer would have made if they had all the information there in a neutral format? And often, if it's not, then that's where a dark pattern has come in. And is the decision going to be in a way that helps the consumer, or is it a decision that is actually steering them away from their best interest? I think when you put those things side by side, you can really see that there is, yes, that line might be really fine between persuasion and coercion, but we're getting into these tactics which are so subliminal. They're really, really quite subtle in the way they're implemented, that we really need to take a step back and go, well, what is it that this is actually doing for the consumer? And what is it that is doing for the individual? And is it helping them, or is it overall hindering their overall experience?
I think that's really helpful. And we have seen this, and I'll come back to the gambling industry, but I think you'll probably have some examples in other areas. And we're all familiar with things like the subscription trap, that you didn't mean to, you meant to buy a product, and all of a sudden you can't buy a product. You have to buy a product every 6 weeks, and you get a discount and free shipping, and you intend to unsubscribe, and then you forget to do it, which is the entire point. And some of these are more obvious, and a lot of the time it's the check boxes that's automatically checked. It's the terms and conditions that no one could possibly read, that are provided at a time that, it's time sensitive, and you certainly don't have time to read it. And sometimes you literally don't have time before there's a click down on how long you can make the purchase. It's the things like how many other people are looking at, this particular thing, or how many urgency queues. So can you take me through then, what are the rules around this? There are general consumer policy laws, I believe, that things can't be deceptive or misleading. So presumably that's the case. But, what about these sort of urgency cues? And what if someone does want to make it and you're being sort of pressured to buy one product versus the other, or someone does keep coming back, but is that in their best interest? Take me through a little bit more of where these worlds and lines lie.
So with our consumer law, we have two really great protections. One is that the consumer law says that businesses can't lie to us. And there's also an obligation that businesses can't do something truly egregious. But there is really nothing in between. And that's where a lot of the practices that you mentioned, which are known as dark patterns, exist. And when we looked at 10 common dark patterns back in 2022, actually, we saw that 8 out of the 10 could actually very happily exist. They're unfair, but they're not exactly illegal. The good news is, in fact, there was a Senate inquiry at the moment, and there was a public hearing happening today as we're recording this, where government is actually considering bringing in what is known as a prohibition on unfair business practices. And that is actually tackling some of the issues, such as dark patterns, and seeing, well, how can we make sure we're protecting consumers? Because there is that gap between lying, so that misleading and deceptive conduct, and the unconscionable conduct. But there is really nothing in between that protects consumers. But we know through our research that there's a lot of harm that can take place in that space.
Talk me through that, because I imagine many people will be familiar with buying something unintentionally, or having an extra month of a subscription, or just the frustration of, going through feedback loops and calling customer centers, or not be able to find a contact number. So what does your research show is the impact of this on consumers? And are there negative economic impacts?
So it's a bit of both. Dark patterns are basically design features. They're built into our apps and our websites that we use every day. And it is purely there to steer our choices, our experiences. And as we've been saying just now, it's often not in our best interest. And there's a lot of work that goes into designing how we navigate those websites and apps. It's things like making that cancellation process so difficult that you put off canceling and you continue to pay for something you don't need or want. In fact, our research has shown that 83% of Australians have had some form of negative effect as a result of dark patterns. It's costing people time, it's costing them money, it's costing their lack of privacy, the control that they have over their privacy, and ultimately it's withering away their well-being. And that's really something that's quite, when you look at it, we saw where people were signing up to things that they never intended to sign up, or people are accidentally making a purchase they never intended to make in the first place. And all these tactics, when they're all built together, they create this environment where you're really locked in, and you are locked in terms of how you navigate it and how you get out of it. And often it's very hard to get out of these situations. And the way the designs have been done are there to prompt you, either keeping you somewhere longer or keeping you spending or making you spend more. And so those are the tactics. And what we've seen through research in terms of economically, what we've seen in the EU, they actually the European Commission actually looked into what the cost was. So the cost of unfair business practices in the online world, such as things like dark patterns, is actually um, costing over 7 billion euros for consumers, but the cost of actually complying was just over 700 million. So you can see that real difference when you look at what it's actually costing people. And when we had a look through using a range of data through multiple different research pieces, we could see that just losing a nominal figure, Australians are probably losing around $46 million a year because of these practices. Getting into products and services or not being able to get out of them in a timely way is actually costing people on an everyday basis.
And not to mention the time and frustration that you have to deal with that. Look, so I really want to hear about your Churchill Fellowship. For those who don't know about the Churchill Fellowship program, it does allow experts in any field of Australia, leaders, to go internationally and learn what's happening in other areas. So it's a huge thing, and a congratulations on your accomplishment of being a Churchill Fellow. So who did you speak to? What did you learn? Where is Australia punching on a global scale?
Well, thank you. So I went away for 7 weeks. I went across 7 different countries. I spoke to over 70 different experts across 25 different organizations. It was a very, very productive 7.5 weeks I had. And there I spoke to consumer advocates, to government departments in other organizations, to regulators, to businesses. And what I found was the one thing has been really helping in this space in the terms of dark patterns is actually that general prohibition on unfair business practices. And it was just something that has been missing from the consumer protections that we have in Australia. And you've got jurisdictions like the US that have had similar protections, like an unfair trading prohibition, since the 1930s. And because the law is general, it's principle based, it means that they've been able to take action against businesses using dark patterns in this century, which is fantastic. And it's those kind of elements that I saw really come through, as well as how enforcement works and what would actually really help businesses do the right thing. Because what's actually happened and what's actually shifted over the last few years is that while we can say people can vote with their feet, well, they actually can't at the moment, because we're locked in one way or another. We're locked in by the tech we use because there's no interoperability and there's no way to move. We're locked in by a service because that's where our community is, or that's the only place to get that product. Or we're caught in by a legal lock-in. So we're caught by the terms and conditions that we've got. So when we say that, well, they can just go somewhere else, often there is nowhere else to go. So having these kind of broader principle-based legislation, which we hope that we are only moments away from getting here in Australia, will mean that Australians will have the same protections. Because what has been happening at the moment is that you could be based in Melbourne, you could be using the same service on the same platform provided by the same business, but someone in Melbourne has fewer protections than someone sitting in Munich. I think that's just a deeply unfair situation that Australians have found themselves in.
I think that's really interesting that essentially without regulation and specific regulation, there's just these unchecked business practices that are standard, probably even promoted as, marketing, depending on how kind of scrupulous versus sharky a commercial platform is. And I find like there's such an onus on informed choice, and it's the individual that, well, it's up to you to make sure your information is private and use a strong password. And there's so much on the individual that we're thinking, do we need to start teaching? Look, we do. We teach these sort of cybersecurity and cyber awareness at young age, but should it be fair? Is it fair that there's like the individual has to be the one checking whether there's like a padlock symbol and, that it's a real website and all of these things, and these websites have no culpability? I mean, and do the laws then have to be super specific so that there isn't just like a workaround, well, this one wasn't outlawed, so we'll do this practice instead? How do you even write these legislations and future-proof them?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think that's the thing. We assume that with these kind of protections, that if we prescribe, then they will be fine. But the fact that the unfair trading prohibition, which is being considered at the moment, by being general, it's basically saying, please don't treat consumers unfairly. Treat them with care and respect. And the fact that you've got that lens that you can then apply to your work, I think that's so much more meaningful than, say, if all like the 10 dark patterns that we had found in our research, if they were prescribed specifically, there'll be just 15 other that pop up the next day and the next day. And then we see things like what the advancements that are taking place in AI. And as they progress through, there'll be other practices that will be considered unfair that we don't even know of as yet. But if the regulator and the government have to keep backtracking, going, okay, what is it now that we can hold businesses against, or what can we hold them to account, that's actually not going to be really great for consumers, because they'll be continuing to wait for some sort of reprieve. So having more general principle-based legislation will certainly help. I'm very excited, as you could probably tell, with this potential new law that will come into place, because it does mean that as dark patterns may evolve over time, the lens of like, is this actually fair for consumers? And also that law is not just looking at financial detriment, but it's proposing that detriment could be more than financial. And that's really important. Certainly in our research, where we were looking specifically at the intersection of gaming and dark patterns, we found people were not only just losing money, but more than half actually had their well-being compromised, and so that it really deteriorated. So there is something there to look at, where it isn't just about what money or how much money someone has lost, but what is actually happening to them overall as their experience online.
Yeah, that's really important. And it makes me think about, different subgroups, because we've got this, idea of a rational actor or an individual who has all the information, presumably, and they're making their own free decisions. But what if there are compromise? There may be issues that prevent them from thinking through. There may be, dark patterns that mean they don't have all the information in front of them, that the important information is obscured and there's irrelevant information provided, and cues and prompts to sort of nudge them in one direction or another. And sometimes it's a case where there's not necessarily one big, very obvious thing that should be, we'll just make that illegal. There's like these little cues that all add up to make an environment. So it's not even so much of saying, that's the one, we'll just get rid of that. Like there's all these sort of different design choices that someone has to operate in. And if they're, experiencing financial stress or psychological stress, or, late at night, at a fatigued state, or in any kind of way cognitively impaired, whether temporarily or permanently, should the same rules apply across everyone, or should there be some sort of onus that, your product and your platform has to be safe even for people who aren't, functioning at 10 out of 10. I'm not quite sure how to say that, because such a variance in why people might not be making rational, informed decisions.
I think it comes back to what is it that you're actually offering the consumer, and actually looking at, well, it has to work for everyone that is using your service or is trying to access your product. If we design for the most vulnerable, ideally it will work for everyone, and I think that is the way we need businesses to start approaching when they are designing online products and services. I'll take an example of the dark pattern of false hierarchy. So that's actually all about making a particular choice stand out over others. And that can be done through just what you were saying before, through size, placement, or even color. And there can be other tactics that can then build across it. So things like scarcity cues, which is that creating that sense of urgency, and activity notifications, which say things like, 125 other people have used this, or 10 other people around here all have actually benefited from this. And it almost helps normalize that the particular option that someone wants to go for is the right option. And we know these tactics work because we've even had where the OECD has done research where they actually did a behavioral experiment, having consumers go through a process of purchasing a TV online. And that experiment found that tactics such as scarcity cues, which create that sense of urgency, led to a 51% increase in actually making a purchase. And tactic of nagging, which is basically those pop-ups that keep coming up, or if you decide to leave or go, don't go yet. Those kind of tactics led to a 95% increase in purchasing an add-on accessory. So we can only imagine when it's in a vulnerable situation, or it's a sensitive situation, or someone is experiencing some form of vulnerability or hardship, what those kind of tactics could do for them. So definitely designing for the most vulnerable and then working from there is the ideal approach, where we're designing for how it should work for people as opposed to how it will make the most money.
I really like that idea, and it does really get to that point of the vast majority of the differences we have in our society, and expecting there to be a one size fits all, particularly when we know that these companies are personalizing things to such an extent. If you're an iPhone user, you get a different website to if you're an Android user based on what they know around iPhone users. If you're in a different location, you might get different personalization. So there's so much data being used against the customer without any transparency. You don't know that that's happening, that you're getting a different price or a different product or a different website. So I want to bridge this into gambling, that where my team is, and I've got a great PhD student, Evelyn, who's doing a replica of an audit that the Behavioural Insights team did in the UK, where they looked at gambling websites. So she and a team in Swansea in the UK were looking at domestic versus offshore gambling websites. It's just an audit. So we're going through and looking at, so it's not a consumer-led one, it's sort of an expert-led one where there's a checklist, and we're looking at things like how many clicks to create an account versus deactivate an account. How easy is it to make a deposit versus making a withdrawal? So we're doing the kind of the standard thing a consumer would do. And what we expect to find is that it will be legal and compliant. But what I'm looking at is what you were talking about before. Is like, what is the commercial alternative? Are all these operators doing the same thing? I expect the risk warnings will be there very much as prescribed in the same text, next to the same font, down at the bottom of the screen. I guess it's a question for, what do you think we will find if you've done any, I know you've looked at gaming, for example. Is there anything specific to different industries that you see? What did you find in the gaming report that might be relevant to what we know about gambling?
Firstly, can I say that sounds like such a fascinating project, and so congratulations to your students for doing that. I have to say, one of the things that I absolutely love in the research pieces that we get to do is the online sweeps and actually emulating what lived experience looks like, which sounds like what your student is doing there. And we did that in gaming. We also did it through subscription traps. We actually followed what the process would be to subscribe to something, and then what the process would be to actually get out. And in gaming, we actually looked at different screens and different placement of dark patterns that came through that actually we had citizen scientists send to us as part of the survey that we then evaluated. And what we saw is that a lot of times it's not just one dark pattern, it's actually a layers of dark patterns that will be used. So at any given point in time, for example, where it might look like that you're about to leave, you may not be able to, because there might be a disingenuous offer or a short-term offer that's made that helps to create that sense of, well, you could delay it. You don't need to do it right now, with the hope that you forget. Or we've seen where confirm shaming is used quite a bit. So confirm shaming is a dark pattern which is all about making you feel guilty about the decision you're about to make. So we've seen that in online shopping where it says, yes, sign me up. No, I just like paying more. And so that's the two choices that you've got. And in gaming, we saw that in where if you're wanting to move or you're not wanting to go ahead, it's showing you what you potentially could win, when the chances of winning that particular prize or that particular loot box is probably very, very, very small. And so it often isn't just one dark pattern, it is often a layers of them, and they will come at different points of the journey. So false hierarchy comes up probably often up front, which means it just makes it really difficult for you to find the actual action that you want to do. Once you find that, it'll probably move into confirm shaming, which making you feel guilty about that choice. It might then layer that with a few scarcity cues saying, so many other people are doing this exact thing and it's fabulous, or look at all these people who have won. And then finally, even if you went right through it, then they'll use the tactic of forced continuity, which is all of this combined, and which is actually also known as the Hotel California effect, based on the Eagles song, which is you can check out anytime, but you can never leave, and where layers of dark patterns will be used to keep you in the system, as opposed to you being able to actually use agency and have your choice to move out. So I think what you'll see is layers upon layers of different dark patterns that are used, and that you'll see some that are used up front, which just make it hard for you to find things, but then there'll be others that will use that emotional connection for you to not then progress ahead.
That's what we're starting to find. We're still in early stages, and maybe we can play a guessing game if you want. How many clicks on we've done? We did sort of a 1 or 2 just to start to train our raters. How many clicks do you think it takes to sign up for a gambling site?
1, maybe 2.
This one was 4, because you don't forget with the gambling site, you actually have to provide your legal information and things like that. So that's pretty good for satisfying that. But how many clicks to deactivate? This isn't even terminating, just deactivating.
Oh, I assume it's probably above 10, if not
14.
More. 14,
so 4 to sign up, 14 to deactivate, and it just goes to show those, and there's the sort of things we're looking at. But and similarly, it's easier to make a deposit than to make a withdrawal. There are anchors on deposits that sort of suggest how much you should, and again, it normalizes you if the anchors are not 0, 5, 10, 15. They're much higher amounts. And look, and arguably this is reducing friction and it's making it easier for the consumer. That these might enhance the consumer experience. And from an industry point of view, I can understand that. That would make it easier if you're trying to make a deposit and you do the same thing. And it is easier if it's just pre-programmed in there. But I guess it's sort of that idea of when do we need to increase friction? Well, from a getting money across the table, we never want to increase friction. So I understand it from a business point of view. And I have to have this approach of trying to be neutral around it and thinking, well, what would the consumer enjoy the most? What's making it easier? The information you want to see as a consumer, you want to see what bet's about to jump next. Where's the next bet? What's the odds I'm going to win? I want to know what am I win. But what's not there is how much you've spent. So it's quite common for someone to come and say, I had this big win and this is what I won. There's nowhere on that page where it says this is how much that cost you. You actually placed in the last 2 weeks, you placed, this many bets. And yes, great, you won this one, but what about the other ones? And we also see the nudge towards the riskier bets. So, and I don't know if you've looked at this in particular, but, what type of, sort of that false hierarchy of, nudging people towards things that have a greater loss rate, and there's not a lot of transparency over how much that, what the margin is. But that's the same with all products. Like, I don't know when I'm buying a tin of Coke how much the Coke in it actually costs. So, I guess I'm trying to ask is what's reasonable, what's standard business practice, and when you've got different layers, are they all problematic, or is it just a certain combination? Where do we go from here?
So I always go by the principle that you should be knowing what you are getting into and what you're paying. And one of the dark patterns is known as hidden costs, where you really don't know, where things may be added on along the way, where you might not see a full price later down the track. And we know it works. There was actually a ticketing company in the US a few years ago, StubHub, and they actually did this research where they split their millions of their customers in half. And so half of the customers, they got to see the full price of a concert ticket up front, while the other half got to see a base price, and then things were added along the way. And what they found was that second group that only saw a base price spent 21% more on tickets and 14% more likely that they completed the purchase. So when you don't have a full sense of how much you're spending, how much does something actually cost, you are likely going to spend more, and you're likely going to be in that space. And we saw that actually just last week. The K-pop band BTS is coming, and their tickets got released, and what you saw was that the actual ticketing company wasn't going to release the price of the tickets until you are past the waiting room. So some of these fans, which are known as the BTS army, have actually pre-purchased a membership which allows them to join the queue earlier, so to do the pre-release, to join in that space. And then they would have been in this waiting room for goodness knows how long with thousands of others. And then they would have seen the price of the ticket, which is probably the base price of the ticket, because then all the other fees come at the last screen with the countdown timer, with everything else there. And so when as a customer, even as an individual, once it's the endowment effect where you have committed, you've invested in this whole process, and now you've gotten to the end, are you really going to go, no, I'm not going to get these tickets, when you are just one click away? So hidden costs can play a really interesting space for consumers, because that tactic means that you really don't know what you're losing, and you really don't know what you're actually going to gain through this purchase. And so we saw that one was one of the ones which has meant that hidden cost dark pattern is often the one where people have spent money or accidentally made purchases that they didn't want to.
I think that's really important. It's not just a one-off action that we're talking about. It's everything that's come before that. And particularly for something like gambling or with gaming, you've got an account. The thing about gambling that's quite unique is there's money in your account. You fund your account before you don't place a bet or buy a product. First thing you have to do is just put money in your account that just sits there. There's no obligations on it. Although I think they actually are. You can't just put money in and then withdraw it, because that's actually an anti-money laundering issue. So there are some rules around that as well. But your money's already in a particular gambling wallet. and then you can place your bet. So it's kind of like house money already. And this has been something that's been part of gambling for a long time. You know, you can't go into a casino and put money down on the table. You've got to get chips, and they're colored and they're plastic and they look fun. They look like toys, not like money. So the same with your gambling account. Once it's just digits on a screen, you're just moving things from one bucket to another as opposed to getting into your wallet each time and, you know, depositing. So they've already set up this frictionless way of placing bets. And then any money that you win doesn't go into your bank account, it goes into your gambling wallet. So again, it's setting you up that you're more likely, and we see from our research that people have wins, they're more likely to actually bet again. The house money effect is such you're more likely to keep betting once you've had a win. Whereas, so it's not just that initial purchase, it's everything else that's going on around it. And that's where I sort of want to ask you around, like, it's amazing the work you've done to change policies, and we will definitely put some links in the show notes around some of these new changes. So how can we influence policy through research? If we're looking at things like an audit, that's great, but it's not showing harm. It's a survey, but then that's correlational evidence. How can, and you know, it's not really ethical to set up people into randomized groups and see who's going to spend more money versus others. How can we produce evidence that can influence policy?
Yeah, it's a question we grapple with almost every day at Consumer Policy Research Centre, because we're like, what evidence is going to stick and what is actually going to help move the needle? I think it's a combination of everything. You're right. It's never just a consumer survey. It's never just a sweep of online sites and seeing what happens and emulating that lived experience. I think it's a combination of everything. I think for us, we've worked for the unfair trading prohibition work, we've worked with other consumer organizations that are frontline. So while we bring the actual the stats, the how are people feeling, what have they actually done, or we've emulated what a lived experience looks like, the case studies that come from frontline organizations are so powerful. So having that network is what actually helps research become stronger and helps that voice lift and be heard by those policymakers. For our last submission, which was to the Senate inquiry on unfair trading prohibition, we rallied together 20 organizations to sign up to this. And we had organizations in frontline consumer orgs who actually shared case studies. So while, yes, there was our research, our evidence, it was the case studies that spoke the loudest on exactly what that harm looks like. So I do think it's a combination of everything, but there is nothing like showing what that harm actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. And I know it can be really difficult, it can be really disheartening, but this is where it's so important to work with those frontline organizations who are seeing this every day and can really show that the harm is often way more than just money.
I think that's actually really useful for listeners to hear, because it means everyone has a role to play, whether you're an individual, a consumer who can make it an official complaint, or represent your story somewhere in research. If you're a frontline worker who can share a story on someone's behalf, whether you work in research or treatment or industry or government, that there is a role. And for consumers in particular, so one of the tools that we're working on in our team is BetWell, which is a tool that allows people to take control of their data, and it takes all of the data someone has about their own betting and puts them into one dashboard so they can see what they're betting, what they're spending, and set their own intentions. Because part of what we find in research is people aren't making a plan. They're sort of getting to the website and then they're subject to all those cues we've just spoken about. And whether they had an intention or not, they're kind of being guided. So if you have a plan in the beginning and you're actually aware of how much you've spent so you can decide this is where I'm going, I think that's the first step, that what you actually need to do. And that's what is sort of eroded once you get to that website because of all the information and cues that try and nudge you away from your plan. If you didn't even have a plan in the first place, and that's even harder to do. So, do you think that's sufficient to have awareness of information? Because the other thing we're looking at is actually the education. Do we need to be teaching people about biases that are triggered? And we don't people aren't stupid, but they might not necessarily be thinking through or be aware of all these triggers and how they're played upon. So do we think, is it a combination of personal awareness, education, skill building? Where do you think interventions can sit in this space?
I think when we look at tactics such as dark patterns, consumer education alone isn't going to cut it, I'm afraid. It just isn't, because you could know all the tactics. You could be someone like me who lived in this space for many years now and is doing the research, and I still get caught up in a subscription trap. And it's because there's so much money and so much effort that is actually being put towards making sure that a particular path is followed by consumers. So yes, consumer education, there's always a place in that. There's always something there. But when you're in that actual space, that's actually a really difficult space to actually then have to backtrack from. So I would say it's really about keeping businesses um, obligated and accountable for doing the right thing, as opposed to, here are the 10 traps that you should be aware of. Check them out on your next on your next online experience. It will go to an extent, but it will never go far enough. One of the things I found out through the Churchill Fellowship when I met with a lot of the experts is that one of the things that's actually really changed over the last few years is that, especially in the gaming space, where it was before, it was about what the idea of the game was, and then you would design everything else around it. Now, often what's happening is that there's a monetization agenda that is actually designed, and then the whole game and everything else is designed around it. So that's a real big flip in terms of how not all, but how some businesses may be operating. So when it's through that lens, no amount of consumer education is going to help
Yeah.
save the consumers in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not appropriate. The consumer is just trying to get what they want. That it's not their responsibility necessarily to be able to outwit these companies that are working against them. So then how do we flip that script? Obviously, there's the laws and the regulations, or we can stop companies doing the worst things possible. But as you say, there's so many of these tactics that are just quite frankly legal and, standard practice. So if an operator, I guess there's two parts of the question. One is, what would an operator do if they wanted their platform to support rather than undermine customers' intentions? So not just, adhere to compliance, but actually do, good practice. And is that commercially viable?
At the moment, some of this is probably not commercially viable, because at the moment there is no way to tell the difference between a business that is trying to do the right thing and a business that is using these tactics in a way that works for them. And I've seen it when I've spoken to businesses overseas who are trying to move ethically, or consultancies that are helping businesses move ethically into spaces where they're really putting consumers up front about and in the center of the way they're designing their products and services. They know they could make so much more money if they just use dark patterns and if they use tactics like these. But reform is definitely one way to help weed out those practices. And then, of course, it comes to enforcement. What ideally you want is people being able to look at businesses side by side and being able to go, no, that's the right business. And actually, for the market to be competitive on trust instead of tactics, that's where we need to move. But for that to move, obviously there's reform, and then there's the bigger picture of how those new laws are then enforced and how businesses are actually held accountable.
And I think it's a lot of businesses putting their money where their mouth is as well, because there's no end of regulated businesses saying, oh, we're the good guys and the offshore sites are all the bad guys. So it'll be very interesting with this audit we're doing to see what we find in terms of practices between the offshore and the domestic regulated sites, if there are differences in that. But I guess it does come down to consumers being able to vote with their feet, that if they prefer to bet with an operator that does put them first, then that's where hopefully the business will go. But it would be nice to sort of aim towards encouraging consumers to use sites that are going to treat them more fairly and have their best interests in heart. Because I certainly am familiar with research that shows that companies that put customers first do have enhanced loyalty, particularly in something like online betting, where most customers have up to 5 different websites. There's a lot. It's very, very easy. They essentially have the same product. It's who you choose to bet with. So I think it is something that should be a part of marketing for gambling sites, to be thinking about how do we make this a genuinely better experience for the individual and the consumers, and put them first, and then the consumers who have a whole lifetime in front of them, if it's a sustainable business model, will hopefully reward them with this. But I don't know if you've seen that actually play out in any particular industries.
So what we've actually seen through our research is, like, for example, with subscription traps, we found that 90% of Australians would happily re-engage with a business that made it easy for them to cancel. That stat in itself speaks volumes of how much people will respect when they have been treated with the same care and respect as well. I think, and how beneficial that is for the business. And then there's also, we've seen where businesses are really thinking about, well, what does it actually mean for them? And we saw through our work in subscription programs, where we actually saw there were services that were offering free trials without having to share a credit card, without having to share any personal details. It was only using your device as a way to know that you were using a free trial. And a free trial was not 5 days, it was 30 days. So to really get a sense of how you're using it, and then you decide where to go from there. And we also saw another business that was giving, like 6 weeks before the annual subscription was coming up to renewal, was saying, your renewal is coming up. Here is the way you can manage your subscription. And when you clicked on that email, it would take you to a very clear button where you could either manage or you could cancel. And it was one button and that's it. And it's those kind of consumer-centered services and those kind of designs that really help a consumer feel valued. I actually really like Nirial talks about this, and he's the author of Hooked and Indestructible. And when I spoke to him as part of my fellowship, he actually spoke about the regret test and how businesses should be looking at their processes and their customer journeys and seeing at what point is there a regret? Would someone have regret if they had followed through with a particular decision or a particular action? I think that's a really great way of looking at it, for actually stepping away from it and putting yourself as a business in the shoes of a customer or your customer, and actually going, would I regret if I had then gone ahead and made that decision? And if that's the case, then thinking about, well, does more friction need to be added here? Or does friction need to be taken out so it's easier for them to do what they need to do? For example, cancelling out of a service. So there's so much that businesses could do today, but we know that at the moment, deception is paying dividends. And until they're held accountable and everyone's on a level playing field, that's going to take a while to change.
There's so much there, and we're definitely running out of time. I think the difficulty in particular with gambling is there's so many purchase points and decision points, and it's not a level playing field. That we do know that some consumers have difficulty controlling their gambling. It's, you know, diagnosed mental health disorder is around gambling disorder, where you, by definition, you can't control your gambling. So, you know, to what extent is something that's a promotion for one person is a coercion for another person, and you know, into what extent an operator is required to identify those patterns. So look, there's so much here. I won't I won't get into it now. What I might do just in closing is give you an opportunity, Chandni, to throw it at me if there's any questions that you have around it, or any kind of thoughts around this area that we haven't had a chance to get into before we close out.
It's fascinating what you're looking into, and I'm so excited that you're actually going down this space of exploring, well, what do these actual apps and websites and systems actually look like for people? I'd love to ask you how what are some of the things or the changes that you'd like to see come into this space?
Yeah, and we've just had some national gambling reforms announced, which were lackluster to say the least. I think, you know, there was a couple that were strengthening existing things that should already be in place, like national self-exclusion, making that better. And then they're going to reduce the content of gambling ads per hour from as many as you want to 3. So, you know, not huge reforms, and nothing at all in terms of product. And that's where I think the real missing piece is. Currently, most reform is around the individual. Okay, let's make it easier for someone to sign up for self-exclusion. Like, you know, let's make more financial counselors available. These are great. These are good. But what about something to actually prevent the harm from happening in the first place? So what about including more friction and making it as easy to withdraw, or making automated withdrawals, you know, to prevent the house money effect? If you have money in your account, that you can't use that as like a savings account, or just like a hedging account that, you know, it kicks the money out regularly. So if you want to make another bet, no problem, just deposit more money, but not that it just automatically sits there to be rolled over. So I'd like to see more positioning around the product to enhance decision making, so that there's no anchors on what your deposit is or what your bet size is. You have to deposit money each time, as opposed to letting the money just sit there and roll over, and making information more accessible to people in terms of when you log in, this is, you know, your lifetime accumulated bet size. So you can see, okay, great, if you want. And again, we're not talking about restricting people or changing what they're doing. We're just making their information, relevant information, available to them. We're forcing the decision-making process rather than like an impulse or a less considered decision. These are changing the way the product is provided. I think will make a lot of impact on how people engage with it. So that's where I would like to see a lot more effort and a lot more research into it.
That sounds so wonderful. And like that focus on prevention as opposed to here are all the supports that need to be available after harm has taken place. I think it's so important. Can I ask a really cheeky question? Those 3 ads in an hour, are they just for television, or is it
Yeah.
also for streaming?
So there's been a lot of contention in this last reform around advertising. It was a massive report, the Murphy report the whole thing started in 2002. So it was a very big report with lots of different recommendations, a lot of focus on advertising. It's pretty much on mainstream media, which arguably hardly anyone watches these days, I have to say. There are watersheds between. So it's during the day, they are getting rid of advertising on, again, mainstream media. At down to 3 an hour after 8:30 p.m. So like it's, you know, slightly stepping in the right, like certainly it's not a bad thing, but it's not really going to solve the problem. Well, a lot of it, as always, depends on the devil, how it's in the detail. You know, what will implementation look like? Like, are there restrictions on influencers, age gates on potentially gambling advertisements? But as to what's happening on social media and more targeted content, not to mention actually personally delivered, because once you have one of these 5 different accounts, you can get emails and WhatsApp and whatever you want, and Instagram. So if you're opting in, you know, there's no restrictions on what people are being promoted with. So I don't think anyone's getting too upset about you know, the slight restrictions. If anything, it'll just help people hone in their marketing budget slightly.
Yeah, it is interesting because the timing of like how a lot of streaming platforms now their cheapest offering or their cheapest subscription is one with advertising, and I've already personally also seen gambling advertising come up when we're watching G-rated or children and family programs, and they've come up. So it is fascinating that you will actually have to pay a premium to not see those ads, which in a cost of living crisis is it's disappointing that you'll have to think about moving up a tier or put up with those ads in the lower subscription.
Yes, look, there's so much we could get into. Look, I'm very aware of your time. I want to close out with a couple of quick questions around where we can find out more. And we'll certainly link to your Churchill report, which I have to say is so well written, not only because of the content in there, but because you have somehow encapsulated, what did you say, 25 interviews in 7 weeks in less than 50 pages with lots of blank spaces and quotes. So it's so readable. So anyone's thinking, oh, I can't have a report, like it's a very readable report. I know I actually did mine as a video report for the same, like no one wants to read another 400 pages. So, I think you and I are on the same page there, and we'll link to that. But what else are you reading right now that people can follow their interest in this space?
So in terms of a book I'd recommend, it's one I've read previously, but it's a really great way to getting into, well, what are these dark patterns, how they're used. And it's written by Harry Brignall, who is the person who coined the term dark patterns, and he's a UX designer, so that's his background. And then he started seeing these come through. And the book is called Deceptive Patterns, and he released it a couple of years ago. When I got to meet him, he writes exactly how he talks. And so it's a really great, easy, digestible book, but it's a great way to get into an intro of what dark patterns is and what does that actually mean. In terms of what I'm listening to right now, I have been listening to I've Got Questions by Sinead Bovell, and it actually explores lots of different emerging tech that is happening in space, like AI, and what might be happening with our data, and really kind of breaking it apart with really great experts. So it's one that I've been really interested in. It can be a bit dystopian at times, but it also just gives you a little bit of a broader example of what is actually happening and what could we be thinking about, especially in terms of our policy recommendations and our research. Where could we be going next, and what could we be looking into?
Chandni, I think we could speak for a lot longer, and it's been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise and taking the effort to look into these dark corners everywhere. And for me, I don't know I have a good answer for what should be considered appropriate or inappropriate, but I do think that what you've really clearly said is that businesses need to be held a lot more accountable, and they need to start designing their products in a much more accountable way and be thinking about, all of their customer base and what is reasonable. I mean, I would think to take a look and say, what they would like to engage with, and for governments and regulators very much to look at what's appropriate for consumers to be able to make appropriate choices. And I really like that point that you made about, is this a choice the individual would have made if left to their own devices, and is there any regret there for the individual, and trying to design to optimize that. Individuals making their choices, they're making it easier for people to do what they want to do, as the take-home message of the product. So these do demand very different responses from regulators and from operators. But I think that what you have also said is that we all do have a role to play in that, whether as a consumer or as a professional. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Sally. And it's such important work that you're doing in this space. I wish you and your students all the best.
That's Chandni Gupta, the Deputy CEO of the Consumer Policy Research Centre and one of the clearest thinkers in Australia and internationally on what digital environments are actually doing to consumer decision making and how easy it is for people, regular consumers, to actually do what they intended to do in the first place. I took some really interesting lessons away from this. First of all, just getting a grip on what is coercive, what's a dark pattern versus what's a standard business practice, or maybe they're not actually necessarily different things, but the role of policy versus operators in actually putting the right practices in place. If today's episodes raised any questions for you, I will advise you to link to some of the resources we'll put in the show notes, including Chandni's reports, Duped by Design, Let Me Out, and Made to Manipulate, all available at cprc.org.au. Made to Manipulate is Chandni's Churchill Fellowship Report, which is extremely accessible and does look at policies around the world. So do check it out. You can find the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen. And the videos, along with the entire back season of the last 5 seasons of the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series, going back to 2020, are on the Brain and Mind Centre's YouTube channel. I would love it if you could please do me a favor and please share this episode or any that you love with your colleagues. Feel free to give me a 5-star rating and follow along so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming content. This series is something that we put a lot of effort into and we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to get in touch, leave a comment so that we know what other content you'd be interested in. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my sincere and deep respect to elders past, present and emerging for all the knowledge they have created and shared throughout generations. I'd like to thank my amazing production crew, Eunice Huing and Fergus Lyons at the Brain and Mind Centre for all of their support. This podcast is brought to you by BetWell, which is our new digital tool to allow people to bet clearly with awareness and intention. Please check it out at betwell.org.au. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thanks for listening.